Yes. Dear colleagues, we are in our plenary session on this day, and I'm glad, very proud to introduce you Dr. Morfью. Dr. Morfью is Dean of Johns Hopkins School of Education. This school is the part of Johns Hopkins University. This school is about 130 faculty members and 2,400 students. Christopher came to the Johns Hopkins University from Iowa University as Executive Associate Dean at Iowa since 2014. Christopher has overseen a rapid expansion of the College of Education's sports and research. Christopher has introduced new collaborative efforts between the college and faculty members elsewhere in the university, aimed at an interdisciplinary approach to understanding human development and learning. Christopher said in the hub, this is the new center of Johns Hopkins University, I've cited before, that just as Johns Hopkins changed medical education and medical research in the late 19th century, I'd like the School of Education to be the place where policymakers, foundations and school leaders expect to find the most relevant and useful research that can shape the field in the coming decades. As I understand, Christopher's presentation will write about this challenge. And please, Christopher, floor is yours.
Доброе утро.
Good morning.
Just barely. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for the very nice introduction. I feel like Oprah Winfrey with this microphone here. People still know Oprah, I'm sure. I'm going to be talking today about building a dynamic school of education is the title of my presentation. However, I think many of the things that I'm going to be talking about are consistent with the theme of this conference, Dynamic Universities for a Dynamic World. And I'm hopeful that you'll be able to see in much of what I'm talking about parallels between what the challenges facing schools of education, which are typical in U.S. universities to faculties of education, the challenges facing schools of education that are similar to challenges facing other faculties and other units within universities around the world. So I'm gonna move around a little bit. I'm a nervous guy, so I'm gonna be walking around. So Emmanuel has set me up very nicely. Emmanuel and I went to a school together in the early 1990s at Stanford, and you will hear in our presentations, I think if you're paying attention, I thought about standing up first and saying, and now for something completely different, a la Monty Python, but I wasn't sure if Monty Python translates. And I think you'll hear in what I'm going to talk about some differences with Emmanuel in terms of my perspective. Some of those differences are a function of the fact that I'm a dean and Emmanuel was smart enough to remain a professor, which is a much better job. And some of them are differences in our ideologies and our perspectives on higher education. But I think if you listen carefully to what I'm going to talk about, there are actually many, many parallels between what Emmanuel was talking about and what I'm talking about. We both recognize that the university needs to change. We both recognize that the units within the university needs to change. And part of that change needs to occur in recognition of very different roles and very different responsibilities within the universities for individuals. So I hope you'll be able to hear that in my presentation. So this is my argument today. And the bottom word there didn't make it onto the slide. I apologize for that. I'm going to be arguing that schools of education, units like my own, where traditionally we have taught teachers, we have taught principals, we have taught school leaders, we have taught and trained educational researchers, people involved in state level and federal level policy. I'm going to argue that schools of education have historically not been dynamic organizations. And this is due to several factors, some of which are specific to schools of education, but some of which are just university factors. There are reasons universities, in some cases, aren't particularly dynamic, and those certainly have an impact on schools of education. I'm also going to argue that contemporary changes in the US and elsewhere have made it, I think, more possible for schools of education to become dynamic and to lead in some areas where they haven't been able to lead in the past. And in order to take advantage of these changes in the environment, schools of education are going to need to make significant changes in the way they're organized and the way they behave. Okay? So that's the argument. You can tell me at the end whether you buy or you sell with regard to that argument. And I won't mention Trump throughout the entire presentation, I promise. Every time I do, I get a little nauseous. Okay, here's the overview of the presentation. First, I want to talk about ed schools as sort of the opposite, historically, of dynamic. I'm going to talk then about how times have changed, what are the ed schools' opportunities to change along with that, and then finally I'm going to give you some examples of what I think a dynamic school of education might look like. Okay? So, first of all, I think it's important to think about, and for me to define what I think about dynamic organizations. This conference is supposed to be about dynamic universities for a dynamic world, right? What does dynamic mean, right? And I suspect between the speakers that you saw, Susan, Renee, Bjorn, Imanol, all the speakers that you've seen, we might have slightly different definitions of dynamic. I think all of them would involve some kind of organizational change, though. Certainly, dynamism is involved. Change is involved with dynamism. Here's what I mean when I talk about dynamic organizations. Dynamic organizations are bold, right? I might even say brave in their willingness to try something different. They're enterprising. That is, they're capable of frequent change. So not just one change, not just two change, but they need to set themselves up for the ability to make significant changes over a period of time. They're proactive rather than reactive, right? So they're changing the environment in some cases rather than just reacting to a changed environment. They're capable of generating and acting on new ideas. And they're designed for connections and collaborations with other dynamic organizations. I would argue that some of these things universities have historically done very well. Certainly, we are capable of, in universities, we are capable of and have a track record of generating new ideas. I think we've been less likely to act on those new ideas in some cases than we've been able to generate them. But I certainly think we're a place that we've generated lots of new ideas over time. I would argue that universities historically have not been particularly bold or enterprising, right? We could talk more about that in the upcoming slides. So here's a quote from one of many books that you could pick up in the United States that is written in a highly critical way with regard to education schools, right? So there are lots of books out there that you could pick up where the author's core argument is ed schools are a problem, okay? This is a quote from one of those books. And I would argue that this quote describes, and I don't necessarily agree with everything in this quote, it's not my quote, but I would argue that this quote illustrates our pictures in ed school as the opposite of dynamic. This quote says that ed schools deserve their low reputation, and ed schools historically in the United States have had a low status or low or bad reputation within the university. And this author argues that what students, the curriculum and the work in ed schools is puerile, it's immature, it's childish, it's repetitious, it's dull, it's ambiguous, right? And that is a function of both the subject matter, what is being studied, what is being taught, as well as the fact that the instructors in many cases aren't of the highest quality. Now, I would argue significantly with much of this quote, but this is an oft repeated description of ed schools, right? And some of it is true, right? From my point of view. Certainly ed schools have not been always the place where the most cutting edge research is being done or the newest methods are being applied to the study of education and teaching and learning. David Labaree, and I would encourage just about anybody here to read this book if you're interested in what I'm talking about today. 2004 published a book called The Trouble with Ed Schools. It's a very good book. David Labaree is a very gifted historian and scholar of the ed schools and education in the United States. He happens to be at Stanford as well. And his book talks about the trouble with ed schools and sort of identifies it historically as well as in a contemporary vein. And he says the trouble with ed schools are many. He says one of the troubles with ed schools historically has been the populations they serve. So ed schools have historically served women who in the United States were ed schools began as normal schools, places to teach teachers, and they served women. And not only did they work with women who are lower status than men in American society and in many other societies, but they also worked with children, right, which are also a low status, signal of a low status profession. And then finally, they worked with schools, which are often considered low status as well. There's several other things that he identifies as the sort of the trouble with ed schools and the reasons that ed schools have enjoyed a very low status and in some cases have been low quality institutions. And he says one of those things is the complexity of teaching and learning. One of the interesting things about teaching and learning in the United States is historically people have thought about it as pretty simple, right? Why can't we simply teach children to read, right? That should be an easy thing to do. When in fact, it's a very complex task to teach children to read, right? You need to make sure that they have the right nutrition. You need to make sure that their parents have read to them before they come to school. You need to make sure that the teachers are trained. You need to make sure that the curriculum is available to help them to read. They might come with different cognitive or neurological differences, right? It's a very complex task, but historically we've looked at it as a very simple task. Ed schools have often also exist at the interaction at the intersection, if you will, of soft knowledge, that is subjective knowledge, knowledge that is typically illustrated with softer methodologies or poorer methodologies, not cutting methodologies, and applied knowledge. Both of these things are low status within the university as well. There's a lack of disciplinary focus in ed schools. So historically and even today, ed schools are a menagerie of historians and sociologists and political scientists and psychologists, none of which, even if they were trained in their discipline, in fact, don't have a job in one of those disciplines. So they're looked upon as sort of the poor stepchildren, if you will, of the folks in the discipline. And then finally, there's been a failure in ed schools to sort of get anywhere, to solve problems. Right? So you heard Renee's talk yesterday, or many of you heard Renee's talk, and I really enjoyed his talk. And one of the differences, if he is in a graduate school of education, but I don't think he would describe himself as an educational researcher, and if he was a traditional educational researcher, he would not have been interested. He would not have been interested in solving the problem of why are people not learning as well? Why are some populations not learning as well in online environments, right? He wouldn't have been interested in applying a randomized clinical trial to the explanation of that and to try to fix that. He would have done a qualitative study on the people who were not doing as well in these online environments and described their difficulties and described the differences between them and the general population. And that would have been a great study if you wanted to understand who these people were, but it wouldn't have gotten you anywhere in terms of solving the problem of online education being more functional, being more utilitarian, right? And reaching these populations. So that's a good example, I think, of things. So congratulations to Renee for breaking out of the ed school mold. So those are the problems that Labaree lists with regard to ed schools. I would add to those some general problems and barriers to dynamism in ed schools and in the university. So not only do ed schools face this sort of historical low status and have these problems that Labaree defines, I would add some other things to them. One, I would say, and this is true not just of ed schools, but of universities as in general, faculty tend to be very conservative and risk averse. Emmanuel just got done talking to you about the conservative nature of universities. A big reason universities are conservative is because faculty are conservative. Not in their political views necessarily, but in their willingness to engage in change, right? In their willingness to engage in risky behaviors, and their willingness to stick their necks out and try something new. And the reason that part of the reason that they're risk averse is because reward structures in the universities favor very traditional activities, all right? You want to get a job as a faculty member in a top-notch university, publish in a top-notch journal. You want to get promoted, publish in a top-notch journal, right? You want to be a star in your field, publish in a top-notch journal, right? There's generally one or two different ways to get there, but they're very traditional ways. So our reward structures favor very traditional kinds of activities. And the dominance of the traditional faculty role is part of that. Finally, I would say that one of the reasons that universities are not particularly dynamic institutions and ed schools aren't particularly dynamic places is this reproduction function, right? That universities engage in, where I look a lot like the people who trained me, and my students look a lot like me, right? And the goal is to essentially reproduce yourself, right? So I train someone to think like me. I train someone to use the same tools I do. I train someone to use the same theories I do. And then if they do those things, I say, congratulations, you're just like me. Now I will give you a PhD and you can go out the door and train someone else to be just like me and just like you, right? So there's this reproduction function in universities. And that doesn't lend itself to a kind of dynamism. It lends itself to a kind of very conservative, slow change over time. So that's the bad news. Here's the good news. The good news, I think, is that times have changed, right? And some of this connects very directly with what Bjorn was talking about yesterday. And it connects very directly with what Emmanuel was talking about in terms of the changing environment for universities. One of the things, particularly in the United States, there's an increased attention on education, educational policy, and how learning occurs. So I would argue that for the first couple hundred years in the American university, and the same I would say for the first several hundred years and more in European universities, we haven't really investigated how learning occurs. So if you ask people, what do we know about how learning occurs? What's good teaching, right? The answer is, I'm not really sure, right? I know a good professor when I see one. I know a bad professor when I see one, right? But there's an increased attention, I think, right now on how learning occurs and what good teaching looks like and what are the components of good teaching and how different kinds of learners can be supported in different kinds of ways, right? And that increased attention on teaching and on learning is a good thing for ed schools because we should be the place where people come to for expertise on teaching and learning. We should know more about that than just about anybody else. Now, the bad news is we don't know enough about that. We haven't been paying as much attention to that as we should have. But we do know more than many other parts of the university. There's also an increased focus in many countries, and particularly in the United States, on educational policy. It's a raging debate. So during the last, I said I wouldn't mention him, so I won't. But during the last presidential debate in the United States, and the last presidential race in the United States, which, as you know, goes on for 3.5 years before the actual vote, there was a lot of attention paid to educational issues, educational choice, charter schools, different kinds of public schools, different kinds of private schools, who should have access, how should we tax ourselves? These are things that get a lot of attention, right? And that's a good thing for ed schools because people are paying attention to the work we do, or at least the work we should be doing. There's also a growth of an education industry in the United States and in other countries. So we have foundations, we have individuals that are starting up places like Khan Academy, and as Renee was pointing out in his presentation, Coursera and Udacity and all these other organizations that are devoted to learning. There's a whole industry, right, serving millions and millions of people around the world that's devoted to education. So entrepreneurs have turned their attention to education in ways that they've never focused on before. And that's a good thing for education schools because we should be engaged in that. It's an opportunity for us to be engaged in that, okay? Labrie pointed out that education schools historically have had low status within the university because they are not disciplined. We are not seen as disciplinary based, right? So we're not economists, we're not physicists, right? We don't have that sort of core discipline, and we're in a soft applied field. Well, the good news is the hot work today, the best work I would argue that's coming out of universities is interdisciplinary work. And that's a good thing for education schools because we are interdisciplinary by our very nature. We bring together, or we should be bringing together, all sorts of people from different disciplines to study issues related to education, teaching and learning, right? Okay? So we bring together information scientists and economists and all these other people. And that used to be a liability in the sense that we weren't a discipline. But I think now it can be a plus. It can be an attribute for schools of education. Schools of education also have been, and studies of learning and teaching have historically been characterized by their qualitative nature, by their lack of ability to identify causation. How does good teaching lead to good learning, right? Or how does different teaching lead to different kinds of learning? The good news is we've made huge advances in experimental and quasi-experimental methods that can be applied, and there's a growing acceptance of these things that can be applied to studies of education. That's a good thing for education research as well. And then finally, there's a lot of people, education deans, some like me, who are acknowledging ed schools' flaws and saying we want to do better. So there's a growing acknowledgement inside education schools of the fact that we haven't done the kind of work we should be doing. So all of these are good things for ed schools. So let me talk about a little bit what a dynamic ed school might look like. Okay? So I talked about ed schools' problems. I talked about the opportunities. I talked about what a dynamic organization looks like. Well, what would a dynamic school of education look like? Well, first of all, it'd be organized around problem-relevant knowledge, okay? Rather than being organized around topics that were of interest to faculty members that weren't necessarily relevant to solving problems in schools, it would be organized around problem-solving, problem-relevant knowledge. Faculty roles would be connected to learning organizations, including, but not limited to, school. So there's a growing interest in teaching and learning, but not just in schools, right? In businesses, in nonprofits, in government, right? And faculty roles would be connected to these kinds of things. We would have new programs and new certificates connecting the traditional ed school core knowledge, learning, school organization, to promising disciplinary-based research and methods, right? So this is, I keep referencing Rene, but I think this is, his work is an example of this. He's taken some core knowledge that has been produced in ed schools, added knowledge from other fields to it, and really expanded upon what it can do. We should be doing more of that kind of work. Students at all levels would be trained in translating research to practice. So again, problem solving. There would be an ability of ed schools, and this is true of other units in the universities, and incentives to work with the education industry to vet and apply entrepreneurial solutions to educational problems. And then finally, and this is relevant to Bjorn's presentation on alliances, we would be allied with other organizations to share our knowledge, to share human resources, and to leverage entrepreneurial opportunities in our environment, right? So this is what a dynamic ed school, to me, would look like, right? It would be organized differently. It would have different incentive structures. People would be doing different kinds of things, and there would be an emphasis on working out with organizations outside the traditional ed school to leverage what we know with what they're doing, what they know to solve educationally relevant problems. Okay? So let me give you some examples and then I'll wrap up here. So, example one, how can ed schools, and I think this would apply to other university units, how can ed schools be dynamic in their organization? So right now, we organize units in ed schools and units in other areas of the university. We organize them according to student type or subject area, right? So in an ed school, that means you might have a curriculum and instruction department where they teach the teachers. You might have an educational administration department where they teach the principals and the superintendents and the state policy makers. You might have a educational psychology unit where we train the counselors, right? And the idea here is we're organized by student type, how students are getting their degrees, or by subject area. I would argue that's probably not the way to be dynamic, right? To organize ourselves that way, to put together people who happen to be teaching the same kinds of students or who happen to have very similar kinds of knowledge. So instead of doing that, and by the way, you could apply the same thing to other parts of the university, and this would be certainly more provocative, right? Right now, we organize by disciplinary background in arts and sciences schools or in natural sciences schools, right? And there's certainly an advantage to doing things that way in terms of that shared common knowledge, right? But it also creates silos. It also creates barriers between folks who are interested in similar kinds of problems, but come at it with complementary sets of knowledge or complementary methodological tools, right? Or complementary conceptual tools. So I would argue, rather than organizing that way, perhaps we should be argued by how we complement each other, how we can build and feed off one another, right? And if you look at arguably the most dynamic parts of the university today around the world, there are places like information science, there are places like public health, right? And what do these units, these new units in most cases, have in common? And what it is they aren't organized by a set of common knowledge. They aren't organized by a set of just common students with common professional goals. They're organized around larger issues, bringing together disparate individuals with different kinds of conceptual frameworks, different kinds of methodological tools, different kinds of core knowledge, and that knowledge is brought together and exponentially amplified as a result of the work that they're doing together, okay? The second part of this, I think, and I would argue this is true for the rest of the university as well, and you see some movement toward this in universities around the world. We would have multiple faculty tracks that recognize, promote, and reward very different duties and expertise, okay? These might include faculty with new roles, including alliance building or building international footprints. So Emmanuel was just talking about the notion of the public intellectual who writes the op-ed in the Washington Post, who writes the op-ed in the Des Moines Register, right? I suppose you all read the Des Moines Register. It's a fine Iowa paper. That is an important role. I would agree with him. Right now, it's not clear to me that we are organized in a way so that there is a reward structure or an incentive structure for people to do those very kinds of activities. So if that's something that's valuable, and we can have a discussion about what is valuable and what is not valuable, then we should have a faculty track that incentivizes and rewards that kind of behavior. Just like we should have a faculty track that incentivizes the kind of behavior that Bjorn was talking about. People whose job it is to go out and build alliances and to create collaborative environments that their students can benefit, that can benefit their university, right? Because right now we have a single faculty track, and that single faculty track says publish or perish, right? And that means that people are dissuaded from writing the op-ed piece because it takes time and they're not going to get rewarded from it. Or it means they're dissuaded from traveling to an international conference and spending a day or two at the end of the conference talking with students at another university or talking with administrators about building an alliance or creating a global cooperative network, right? Because it's not clear to them how that's going to pay off for them in terms of their CV and their promotion. So we need to have tracks that recognize very different kinds of behaviors we want from faculty, because those are important things to do, and unless you reward people for doing them, people aren't going to do them. People are going to be scared to do them. They're going to be risk averse, okay? There need to be incentives and rewards that recognize the very disparate needs of schools of education, but also other parts of the university, okay? So the traditional faculty member's role might be thought of as status building, right? Worrying about the university's ranking, publishing the articles, getting the citations, getting the external grants, right? The reality is we know those things don't pay for themselves, right? No matter the indirect costs that might come with an external grant. So we need to have other faculty and other high status roles. And this is very important because we can't have the traditional faculty member at a high status role and the other faculty members in a low status role that are doing other things. So we need to have other high status faculty roles that are individuals who are rewarded and promoted for things like knowledge generation or revenue or network building, okay? And then finally there needs to be an active professional development of the next generation of leaders. One of the things I mentioned early on in this presentation was the universities are very good at producing themselves over and over and over, this reproduction function, right? The problem with that is I'm very good at producing somebody who looks exactly like me, who does similar kinds of work, who thinks very similar to me, right? But we haven't been very good at producing leaders of universities. So the way we've identified leaders of universities is to say, well, you're very good at publishing, perhaps you should be dean. Or you're very good at publishing, perhaps you should be rector or you should be president, right? And we all know that the people who are good at publishing aren't necessarily the people who are good at leading. we need to recognize, reward, and incentivize the development of administrative leaders. Right, so that we don't have the kinds of managers that Imanol was just talking about, who don't recognize and value the different parts of the university and aren't equipped to provide the kinds of infrastructure and capacity building that universities need. So that was one example. That was organizational examples. What would a ed school look like that was dynamic in curriculum? Well, it would be more flexible than it currently is. It would have programs. It would not just degree programs, but it would have certificates. Right? That people in businesses or people in schools or people in other parts of the university could purchase, right? Take several courses, and they would have certificates that would connect what ed schools do with the knowledge that they need in these other organizations and leveraging knowledge from other parts of the universities. So, and I'm being a little selfish here. A couple of these are from the Johns Hopkins School of Education, so forgive me. Mind, brain, and teaching. We have a certificate in mind, brain, and teaching. I think that is a good example of leveraging some of the work that's being done in neuroscience and the cognitive sciences and other part of the university with what we know in education. Autism, right? There's been an explosion around the world in children that are diagnosed as autistic, right? How are we going to help these children learn? We know a lot about autism in psychology and in the neurosciences and in the medical sciences. How do we combine that with what we know in schools of education to better equip these children to learn, better equip organizations to help them learn? All right. Mental health in adolescence. That would be another example of something that these are certificates or new kinds of degree programs that are organized around ideas and problem solving rather than about subject area or commonalities. And then we would have applied degree programs that would push back against traditional norms, right? So professional doctorates would be one example of that. Another program might be a focused master's program for discrete practitioner groups or professionals who could benefit from understanding learning. We would have programs that focused on quasi or experimental methods that were designed to identify causation, right, between teaching and learning and organizations and learning, right? And we would have curricula that expose students to translational work so students could graduate ready to be educational entrepreneurs. And I know entrepreneurs might be a bad word in some way, but it's the word I'm using to describe this. People who are equipped from day one to solve problems, to identify resources to solve problems. Okay? So that's, I think I'm at the end of my time. That is, I'm hopeful we'll have some time for questions here. When I'm thinking about dynamic universities for a dynamic world, I think about my unit, the unit I'm in charge of leading, and I'm thinking about dynamic schools of education. I think a lot of what I talked about could be translated very easily to arts and sciences schools, to natural sciences schools, to other kinds of divisions within the university. And I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Christopher, for the excellent presentation. Colleagues, please. Коллеги, прошу задавать вопросы и представляйтесь.
Спасибо большое Кристоферу за очень интересный доклад. Наталья Ладыжец, Удмуртский университет. Я бы хотела задать вопрос по поводу, здесь прозвучала подготовка Educational Administration. Значит, у нас это называется по-русски менеджер образования. Вот какой вы стратегии придерживаетесь? Это двухуровневая подготовка сразу абитуриентов после школы или это все-таки master's degree программа? Потому что у нас, поясняю свой вопрос, в России, например, педагогическое сообщество, оно отторгает таких социально-зеленых менеджеров, которые только из университетов приходят. То есть с нашей точки зрения целесообразно все-таки эту дополнительную подготовку получать уже при наличии определенного педагогического стажа, когда есть хорошая ориентация уже в школьной среде. Спасибо.
Thank you. I think I understand the question, but if my answer does not satisfy you, please follow up. So in the U.S., when I talk about educational administration and when you talk about educational managers, I think we're talking about principals, the leaders of what we would call buildings, school buildings, rather than leaders of school districts, right? And the traditional training for principals has been a post-baccalaureate master's degree, or in some cases a post-baccalaureate certificate that is consistent with the state Imanol mentioned that states in the United States have a lot of freedom with regard to education that is consistent with states' licensure requirements or credentialing requirements. I'm not sure I understand. The middle part of what you said suggested to me that that there is some debate about the training needed of principals, of school managers, right, school administrators. In the United States, I think that debate is going on as well, and I think the more progressive of us, I would hope I'm in the progressive camp, would argue that principals need significant training, not just in advanced educational knowledge, but also in knowledge related to budgets and finance and human resources, right? The idea being that a school principal is an incredibly important person, that there's plenty of research out there that documents quite clearly that unless you have a good principal, virtually nothing else matters, right? And being a good principal requires not just knowing the advanced knowledge about education, but actually you have to understand how to manage people. You have to understand how to manage budgets. You have to understand how to perhaps use money to build a new building or to work with a larger budget at the district level. So those things are important as well. I'm not sure I understood the final part of your question, but I think you were asking about whether teachers thought that advanced knowledge was necessary to become principals. And if that was the question, I would say certainly I would argue, and I think virtually all of my colleagues would argue, that there is advanced knowledge necessary to be an effective school principal, school manager.
Коллеги, прошу.
I'm intrigued by your comment about the need for foundations, kind of a foundational approach, which I agree with completely. I think what is often missing in ed schools is that the kind of rigor and intellectual richness of the history of education, sociology, economics of education, or anthropology of education perhaps especially. However, I would be reluctant to then insist upon locking that into the straitjacket of the main departments and the main disciplines. And there's one perhaps especially salient illustrative example which brings us back to Imanol's comments. So you think about the types of economics work that would be most relevant to schools and school practice, and it's probably economic philosophy, the history of economics, sort of political economy or even critical political economy, but those are precisely the subfields most marginal or most derided by mainstream heavily quantitative departments of economics. Mm-hmm. So in other words, there's a really interesting tension and a difficult one, a boundary issue between the type of foundational or disciplinary work relevant to ed schools and what the mainstream of the disciplines are actually doing.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you, Mark. On the other hand, and maybe this is the optimist in me. I tend to be optimistic professionally and cynical personally. The fact that departments like economics have decided to essentially marginalize some of the subfields there doesn't necessarily make it a problem for ed schools to adopt some of these things, particularly if ed schools can demonstrate their utility in actually solving the problems that the educational industry wants to solve, that government wants to solve, that foundations want to solve. So I think if you can use these marginalized tools that have been marginalized perhaps, or concepts that have been marginalized in other fields, but if you can use them to demonstrate to the Gates Foundation or to the federal government or to Udacity or Coursera that there's utility and functionality in these concepts, I think then they become very valuable again, because then they become a foundation or a tool for leveraging again what it is you're doing with what I was talking about in the second or third slide, which is the huge opportunity here is this educational industry and interest in education. That really the educational industry has only existed for a couple decades, right? And the growth in interest that surrounds that. When in the United States, when business becomes interested in something, everyone becomes interested in something. When there's a capitalistic opportunity, then all of a sudden everyone's interested in it, right? And education has suffered for many years because industry and I'm not entirely excited about industry being involved in education, but it's an opportunity. It's a place for education to leverage. So I think I wouldn't be concerned about hiring somebody in a field that was marginalized in economics, particularly in economics, I would say, if they could demonstrate to me that had value for solving, for identifying, causality between what was occurring in a school or in some other learning setting and some outcome that was particularly important.
Коллеги, прошу.
Ефимов Валерий, Сибирский федеральный университет. Сибирский федеральный университет, Ефимов Валерий. Я хочу задать вам вопрос не как декану педагогического факультета, а как человеку, который озабочен решением проблем образования. Если в индустриальной фазе развития человек должен был уметь читать, потом прийти на фабрику и начать работать, то сейчас ситуация меняется, и люди приходят в другой мир. Соответственно, как-то могут поменяться и содержание образования, и модели образования, и цели образования. То есть, каким вы видите вот этот новый мир, и как понимают его, как строятся для соответствия ему педагогические факультеты, что они готовы изменить в своих методах и, соответственно, в широкой практике образования. Спасибо.
So thank you for your question. I'm not sure that I can separate my dean me from my man me, but I will try. For most of their history, for most of our history, schools of ed have been focused on producing, as you say, people for the industry of education. People whose job it is to do one of several things, either to be a teacher, or to be a educational manager, as the previous question said, a principal, or to be a policymaker with regard to education. I would argue that just as it's very clear to me that we should be less focused on producing people with skills for jobs in the arts and sciences or in the natural sciences. We should be less focused on producing people for specific jobs in schools of education. Rather, we should be producing people who are liberally educated, who have a broad set of tools, who can understand which tool might be useful for which kind of problem, and who are equipped to change professions and change jobs throughout their career, but in every change will be equipped at some, functional, important level to jump in and immediately start improving the organization in which they work, or in fact starting in their own organization. So I would be less interested in any unit in the university, including ed schools, and I would be less interested in promoting any unit in the university that was focused on producing students for jobs X, Y, and Z. And I think it's our job in the university to produce students who, most importantly, can communicate, can solve problems, and can think for themselves. And I think ed schools, in that sense, are no different than any other part of the university.
Okay, thank you so much. Zarema Kasabiyeva, New Economic School. It's more inspiring. Your presentation is also very inspiring because talking about dynamics in the education, you are a representative of the school, which is only 10 years old, but it's already on the top.
You've done your homework. Very impressive.
Yes. Top ranked schools in US. I have some maybe not so general questions, but at the slide where you're talking about the factors or some bullets, about what dynamic school should obtain, how general or transferable are those factors for other fields, not only for educational schools, but for graduate schools or other schools? It's the first question. And the second one, it's very, very important. You mentioned multiple faculty tracks. It's very, very difficult, I would say, problem, So how you really solve it inside the school, because these multiple tracks, from my experience, for example, tenure track versus teaching track, it's very, very, sometimes it hurts people, mostly outside tenure track. So, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, let me deal with the last part first, and it's related to the first part of the question. I think that's one of the most transferable parts. I think not only do a dynamic ed school need to recognize very different faculty roles. I think any university needs to recognize very different faculty roles. And you're absolutely correct in saying that's very hard to do. There are certainly places in the United States and elsewhere I've been that have different faculty tracks, but usually they are. Those other tracks are characterized by lower status, lower pay, a much broader range of responsibilities, and the sort of expectation that if you can't make it in the tenure track, then maybe you can do some of the other kind of work, right? And all of those things are problematic, particularly when combined with the fact that universities have existed for 1,000 years with sort of the research professor, right? The whatever the equivalent of the tenure track professor throughout the centuries. So I think I absolutely acknowledge the difficulty of this, but I would also say that many of those hurdles can be overcome. And I think and the reason I think they can be overcome is I think there are many highly qualified, incredibly smart people who want to do some of these other kinds of things, who want to teach, right, more than they want to do research, right, and see that as their calling, right, even coming out of some of the elite, some of the very elite schools who realize after getting their PhD at a Stanford or at a Harvard that I'd rather probably teach. I mean, that's really what I see myself as doing. Or people who are really good at building networks and building alliances and finding entrepreneurial activities that their university can benefit from. So I think those people are out there. I don't think you have to manufacture them. I don't think you have to artificially create them. I think they exist. I know they exist because I'm around them all the time. So the question is how do you attract them, and how do you create an organization where they don't feel like second-class citizens, right?
So what are some tools maybe you can share?
So here are some things I'm trying to do right now. First of all, I know everybody doesn't respond to money, right? But money is important, not just because people respond to it, most people respond to it, but because it signals status. So you simply can't pay people if in fact it's important for your organization to produce revenue in new programs where you need the best teachers and you need directors of programs that start up these programs and help recruit students and do all of the things that we know that happen in successful programs, then you've got to pay these people. Right? And you've got to create a quality of life for them and an environment for them that is just as nice and just as supportive as it is for the tenure track research professor, right? So not just pay, but how you assign them duties. What role do they have in shared governance? Emmanuel was talking about shared governance. Shared governance can't be just for the tenure track professor. It also should be for the professor who's contributing to the university in other ways, right? They have to have a seat at the table, right? I talked about professional development of leaders. It can't be the case that the only way to become a dean or a provost or a president or a rector is to go up the traditional academic track. There have to be other tracks. And I'm not advocating very clearly that we should go out and hire somebody who ran a Fortune 500 business who doesn't know anything about higher education. I'm not advocating for that. What I am advocating for is promoting people into leadership positions who do different kinds of things and who recognize that the contemporary university requires revenue, requires networks, requires collaborative opportunities that are built with other kinds of skill sets. Right? It certainly can be done. Are you fighting, hundreds of years of status and hundreds of years of culture? Absolutely. But if you inside your organization value these things, you can signal in lots of different ways that you value these things, right? And those are some of the ways that I think it can be done.
Коллеги, прошу, был вопрос еще.
Тамара Немчинова, Санкт-Петербургский государственный университет. Я почти услышала ответ на свой вопрос, но я задам все-таки его. Вы говорите о том, что преподаватели консервативные, вот предыдущий вопрос тоже с этим был связан. Меня волнует вот последняя часть вашей презентации, спасибо за презентацию, по программам. Вот здесь уже тоже на конференции говорили о том, как нужно создавать новые программы, был хороший доклад Томского государственного университета, но все-таки не до конца понятно. Это все равно какие-то идеальные модели, о которых вы говорите. Вот должен быть какой-то суперпреподаватель, который должен знать рынок, должен знать конкурентов, должен знать потребности предпринимателей, да, для которых он должен создавать программу. В смысле, он создает для студентов, но для которых он должен создавать этих новых студентов. Либо это должен быть хороший руководитель, который должен найти такого хорошего преподавателя. Все-таки как вот в жизни притворить вот это? Вот кто должен инициировать программу, кто должен отслеживать этот рынок? Как создавать эти новые программы? До конца мне так непонятно. Спасибо.
Thank you. Good question. And that's not easy, certainly, finding the right people to do this. And part of the reason it's not easy is because we haven't traditionally hired these people in universities and we haven't trained these people in universities. So, coming out of a PhD program, as I mentioned, Imanol and I were at Stanford together, right? We received, I shouldn't speak for Imanol, but I will. We received virtually no training, or actually zero training in how to teach, right? We received no training in curriculum, in constructing curriculum, right? I certainly didn't. Did you? Right? So the way we train people, the next generation of people in the academy, in universities, we are training people to make sure they don't have these kinds of skills. So I would argue we need to look at the way we train PhDs, the way we train people who are coming into the university, and equip them with a set of skills so that they're actually coming in with the ability to talk about curriculum and talk about teaching and talking about how curriculum meet learning needs of students. Every university I've been at, there have been, even with all of the conservative nature of faculty and the reproduction function that I talked about, and the fact that the faculty don't get trained to teach and they don't get trained in curriculum, even so, every university I've ever worked at and every university I visited, there are people with ideas, new ideas about a degree program or about doing something different. Right, and I think many of us, many of the culture of many universities is designed to shut those people up, right? Rather than invigorate them or make them more enthusiastic about these new ideas. So I think part of it is creating a culture, and the way you do that is some of the things I was just talking about in response to the last question. But I also think it's communicating about. And expanding upon what the mission or what the vision of the organization is going to be. Is it going to be a traditional unit of the university? Is it going to be a traditional university? Or are you going to be doing new things? And if you're doing new things and talking about what those new things are and providing resources for those new things, then I think the people with new ideas will be emboldened to communicate their ideas and to help construct new ideas. I guess that's how I'd answer the question.
Yes, I'll defer to my Russian colleagues if anybody else has a question. But if not, I have a quick comment that connects to that last question and also cuts across quite a number of the keynotes. And it was kind of implicit in Christopher's presentation, but which is taking concepts of technology transfer or entrepreneurship and incubators, but taking them, not just leaving them in the life sciences and pharmaceuticals, but really taking those basic structural ideas and those kind of mechanisms for innovation, applying them to the creative industries, to social innovation, to educational services, and especially community development, community well-being. And I think there are, in fact, some very innovative examples of that around the world. I've seen some of them in Russian universities, where they've created kind of cultural technology parks in an effort to work in museums and tourism and ecotourism and other areas. And there's a tremendous opportunity there, as you suggest, to kind of reinvent what it means to be entrepreneurial.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think going back to what Emmanuel was talking about, it's important to remember that in the United States and around the world, what we see is this mass and homogeneous investment and enthusiasm about investing in STEM, right? And as Emmanuel said, this investment and enthusiasm for patents, right? The reality is those are incredibly expensive areas to invest in. I'm not suggesting we stop investing in them, but I am saying they're incredibly expensive. And as Emmanuel was pointing out, just like college football in the United States, you rarely see a positive return on your investment on your $3 million startup package for the new professor in physics, right? Or the new professor in biomedical engineering. That's probably a black hole. You're probably going to lose money on that. And with the growth of the education industry, and with the interest in trying to solve learning problems, some of the problems that Renee was talking about, some of the corporations he was talking about, there's an incredible opportunity to invest a fraction of that amount of money with the potential of a return that is very, very significant and the ability to change many, many lives in the process, right? So you could invest, rather than investing $3 million in the startup package for an assistant professor in biomedical engineering, you could invest $150,000 in the startup package for somebody involved in information sciences or technology and education, and have them come up with some curricular products, some new technologies, some ways of delivering education, some ways of solving the distance education, the online education divide that Renee was talking about, and that could be an incredibly fruitful investment, productive investment, not just in terms of changing lives, but actually in terms of generating revenue for the university. And the risk is much, much smaller than the risk is investing in some of the STEM areas that we see.
Да, коллеги, прошу еще.
Dmitry Kochetkov, Euro Federal University. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation and your very good words about importance of money and good payment for engaged people. They sounded really like music for me. And as for the point of the dynamically changing environment, fully agree with you. And in my opinion, the main trend of the present is digitalization. And digitalization eliminates borders between countries, between regions, and in higher education maybe even faster than in other industries. Accordingly, two questions. Well, the first question, do you have a program or a course in digital leadership in your School of Education? And the second question is more philosophical: how to find balance between globalization and cultural identity in this digital world?
So let me answer the first question, then I might ask you to repeat the second. So we actually do have a course. We actually have a course in a program in digital learning that used to be called Technology and Education, but is I think I've only been at the university 2 months, so I'm still learning our new programs. But I believe it's called digital learning. So that's actually a program we do have. More importantly, we're developing a course that is distance-based, that is talks about technology and creativity. Right, and the idea being that we have a very good strength. We have a strong faculty area in creativity and gifted and talented student development, and the idea is what can we learn from creativity that we can leverage and use in other areas. What do people need to know about creative people and the creative mind and the creative process that you can use to inform technology? You can use to inform other kinds of learning. So, could you repeat the second question for me?
In the digital world, how to find balance between globalization and cultural identity?
That might be beyond my pay grade. I don't know the answer to that question. I think that might be I'm not sure Renee does either, but that might be closer to his work. You know, we have a lot of online enrollment actually in my school of education from around the world, and I don't know that we spend a lot of time talking about how cultural identity is sort of intersects with technology and distance learning. We probably should, and you know, it may be some of the and I don't know, for example, how that affects, you know, people's ability to persist or complete the programs that we have in our school. And your question makes me think I should know a lot more about that. So you've inspired me to go ask what we know about that and to figure out if there are, in fact, some things that are going on in the success of our students that may be a function of different cultural identities.
Thank you.
Colleagues, now we have no more time.
Could I
for this discussion.
Could I say one thing really quickly? And that is this last slide that I had up here. We have the 15th annual workshop on higher education reform. The 14th meeting was recently in Hiroshima, Japan, and the 15th meeting will be in Baltimore at our School of Education, Johns Hopkins University. And if you are interested in this workshop, which will be a 2-day workshop in September of 2018, please contact this person, Antigone, one of our faculty members, and she will give you more information about it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Guys. Thank you, Kristofer, for this very interesting presentation and fruitful discussion. Thank you.